Hello my beautiful watchers and welcome back to Lost in Adaptation. Quick heads up, this episode is mostly going to be lacking my usual attempts at humour. It's funny how a story about fascism, rape, kidnap and murder doesn't exactly provide a lot of comedic opportunities. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is the first of a trilogy of books written by a Swedish author named Stig Larsson. All three weren't fully published until after his untimely and unexpected death in 2004. Its original Swedish title translates to Men Who Hate Women, and despite Larsson making his wishes clear that he would never want it changed, I suspect the complete unmarketability of that title won out in the end when it was published to the rest of the world. In 2009, the book was adapted by a Swedish production company, and the resulting film was a box office success both there and worldwide, making the very existence of this film a little confusing as it came out a mere 2 years later. It's still set in Sweden, the plot isn't drastically changed. Even though there's a much higher budget, there's not exactly a lot of opportunity for special effects in this story, so there's not much difference there either. As far as I can see, they spent $90 million providing an alternative to watching something subbed or dubbed. With that in mind, you might be wondering why I'm doing this one at all, as many consider the Swedish film not only the original, but also the far superior one, and unlike this film, it did well enough to warrant 2 sequels. Well, there's 2 reasons for this. One is this was the one that was requested on Patreon, and 2 is that I think more of my target audience will have seen it. I'm afraid these films aren't different enough to justify their own episodes and not numerous enough for the Dem Oscars, but as a compromise what I'll do is I'll mention it if I feel there's a particular part of the book that one film did significantly better than the other. Hey, we finally have another film where the similarities are numerous enough and consistent enough that a list of them also serves as a synopsis of the film's plot. It starts with Mikael Blomkvist, an idealistic financial reporter with a strong moral code, losing a court case accusing him of unfounded slander of a rich businessman named Wennerström. He's forced to pay damages and spend a short time in prison later in the year. The media coverage of his trial apparently catches the attention of an elderly former business tycoon named Henrik Wanger, who's haunted by the memory of his niece Harriet's sudden and unexplained disappearance almost 40 years before, an event he's constantly reminded of every year by the arrival of a gift of pressed flowers on his birthday, something Harriet used to like doing for him. Wanting to hire Blomkvist uses his inquisitive mind to have one last crack at solving the mystery, but not being quite sure what kind of person he is, he hires a security firm to do an in-depth background check on him. The firm's best researcher happens to be a teenage girl with some serious psychological and emotional issues named Lisbeth Salander. She succeeds in providing an incredibly in-depth report on Blomkvist, but starts developing problems of her own as it turns out she'd been previously declared mentally incompetent by the government, so an appointed guardian has full control over her life and assets. Unfortunately, her newest guardian turns out to be a sadistic pervert and starts violently sexually abusing her. Due to her serious trust issues, she doesn't go to the authorities, but she does secretly film the rape to use as leverage, then takes violent revenge on him and tattoos his crime on his chest. Meanwhile, Blomkvist is approached by Wanger and offered a huge financial reward to move to his town for a year and try to solve his mystery, and as a bonus, he offers him some information that will help him actually bring Wennerström down once and for all. Blomkvist agrees to take the job over the strong objections of his boss and casual lover, Erika Berger. Blomkvist starts his investigation, spending a massive amount of time simply going over the initial investigation and the following 40 years of attempts by Wanger to find the truth, and getting to know the Wanger family, discovering that with the exceptions of Henrik and his nephew Martin, they're all former fascists and generally vile people. Against all expectations, he actually stumbles on a few new leads around the same time that Henrik has a non-fatal heart attack. Deciding he needs help solving this, he ends up finding out about Lisbeth, and, impressed with the amazing, if uncomfortably invasive job she did on him, hires her as his assistant. Together they eventually piece together enough evidence to realize that Harriet's deceased father was a serial killer and rapist, and his son Martin had taken over the horrific family business when he died. Martin gets the drop on Blomkvist and tries to kill him, accidentally admitting he has no more idea about what happened to Harriet than the next person in the process. Fortunately, he's stopped by Lisbeth, who chases him as he tries to flee. Martin then gets into a traffic accident and is killed. The team then figure out that Harriet isn't dead after all, and had really gone into hiding to escape her incestuous father and brother. Blomkvist tracks her down and, after finding out that she had killed her evil father in self-defense, an event everyone pretty much agrees was a good thing, reunites her with her loving uncle. The info that Henrik provides on Wennerström turns out to be old and useless, but luckily Lisbeth had, just for fun, installed invasive malware on his laptop and has all the goods on his more recent and extreme illegal activity, and Blomkvist uses it to destroy his empire and drive him into hiding abroad. Lisbeth then uses the distracting upheaval to steal all of Wennerström's vast wealth using a false identity. I'm gonna come back to him more later, but I just want to say, physically, Daniel Craig makes for a damn good Mikael Blomkvist, having been described as a handsome blonde older gentleman. A point in the Americans' favour here as the Swedish actor? I mean, can you imagine multiple women throwing themselves on this guy? I'd totally do Daniel Craig. The film also did a damn good Martin, and I like the way they showed the real reason he started killing people. Seriously though, even if you've read the book and know the twist, the film can still almost make you like Martin Wenger, and that's quite an achievement. He comes across as a genuinely friendly and helpful guy, trying to do his best to save a failing business and be one of the few redeeming features of a truly horrible family, so the revelation that he's a cold-blooded serial rapist and murderer is still a tad upsetting. They also successfully captured the horror that comes across when he explains that he's not doing this for religious reasons like his mad father, or because he's a Nazi like his evil uncle. He's just doing this for the sheer horrific pleasure of it. One very good likeness to the book in this film is Mikhail's relationship with his boss and friend at Millennium Magazine, Erica. They've been lovers for decades, despite them both being married to other people at some point. Apparently her husband somehow accepted the relationship and didn't object, but his wife did eventually leave him. The film also included the parts of the book where she makes a deal with the Wenger family to financially save the magazine, ignoring Blomqvist's objections about how this will complicate matters for him. The traffic accident on the island's only bridge that distracted everyone while Harriet made her escape is impressively accurate to the book. I like how they put a lot of effort into filming the flashbacks in this production. It's fine just hearing Wenger describe things in the book, but fortunately the film remembered the show don't tell rule. Blomqvist's initial misery at the prospect of his impossible task and the incredibly shitty weather is amusingly accurate to the book. Another accuracy to the book, and a point in the American film's favour, is Lisbeth realising she was just a little bit in love with Blomqvist at the end, but then getting kicked in the heart as she's given a painful reminder that he's an insatiable man-whore. In the 2009 Swedish version, when she briefly visits Blomqvist in prison, it seems that he's way more into her, and it's not made clear if she has any particular feelings towards him aside from sexual attraction. Plus it appears that she's left Sweden altogether at the end to assume a life of wealth with all her stolen money. Not bad, girl with a dragon tattoo, not bad at all, but if I've learnt anything on this show, it's that no filmmaker has, or probably ever will, manage to completely resist the urge to fuck with the book just a little, so let's take a look at... The obvious elephant in the room is Blomqvist being British now. Craig makes no attempt to impersonate a Swedish accent, so my first assumption was that his backstory had been tweaked and now involves immigration, but he's still got a very Swedish-sounding name and his new foreign status is never acknowledged in the film. This, along with everyone in Sweden deciding to speak English now, are apparently things we are simply not supposed to question, as they can't be explained without breaking the proverbial fourth wall. There are some changes to Lisbeth, but they're fairly subtle. In both versions, she clearly has some serious issues, but in the book, they manifested themselves with her being unnaturally stoic and doing strange things like simply not responding to direct questions that she didn't like, or getting up and leaving the room mid-conversation. Rather than keeping her as this blank, unreadable figure, the film presented her as being slightly more talkative, but also more obviously socially awkward. It's interesting that both films made mention of her setting her abusive father on fire, something that didn't come up in the books until the second installment. The two major breakthroughs in the case, noticing the irregularities in the photographs and realizing the numbers in the journal were references to biblical passages connected to the murders, happened in the wrong order in the film. In the book, the very first new lead that Blomqvist finds in the case is Harriet looking in the wrong direction in a photograph, starting him off on a quest to track down a bunch of amateur photographers. Then his daughter visits later on en route to her Bible camp and recognizes the chapter and verses. In the film, Blomqvist had only just begun to look at the photographs when his daughter turns up, then it's actually Lisbeth that notices the photographer in the background. It's not massively damaging to the plot, but it's one of several changes that took credit away from Blomqvist and gave it to Lisbeth. If you were hoping this had been done better in the Swedish version, you'd be disappointed. They did it differently, but just as wrong, as Blomqvist did clock the photo, but then they cut out his daughter altogether. Now it's Lisbeth who noticed the biblical connection and emailed Blomqvist about it. This is actually way more off book, because it means that Lisbeth voluntarily involved herself in the case instead of being approached, and it's also super out of character for her to send someone such obvious evidence of her illegal cyber activity. The destruction of Lisbeth's laptop, the act that started the chain of events leading to her sexual assault, was a blameless accident in the book. The film changed it so it was an act of violence, something that might be the influence of its predecessor at play. That was a violent but powerful scene in the Swedish film. I kind of found that film Blomqvist was a bit more of a pansy than the book version, and his new nationality might be to blame for that. In times of crisis, Swedish Blomqvist relied heavily on his military training he got during his national service, something that we British are thankfully not subjected to. Henrik Wanger's made a bit nicer in the movies. The Henrik of the book only gave off the impression of being a kindly old man, but a sharp person could easily tell that he had a cunning and strategic mind underneath. He was still a good person overall, but he knew exactly how to get his own way and rarely failed to do so. Things like his offer to help the magazine and the worthlessness of the dirt he had on Wennerström were shown as honest attempts to help in the film as opposed to calculated manipulations like they were in the book. In the book, it's not made entirely clear what Lisbeth was planning to do if she caught up with Martin in the final chase, or if his crash into the truck was accidental or suicide. In the film, they went down a more murdery route, with her asking Blomqvist's permission to kill him, running him off the road, and looking like she was going to straight up execute him if he hadn't blown up first. I'm not doubting that Salander had it in her to kill the murderous bastard in both versions, but she was just saved from herself a lot more in the novel. In the book, Blomqvist and Lisbeth eventually figure out that Anita Wenger, Harriet's cousin, helped Harriet escape, go to visit her in London, and trick her into contacting Harriet so they can track her down. It's interesting that both film plots ended up killing Anita off long before the movie started, started. In the American version, Harriet had completely assumed Anita's identity and was living in London. This is a okay twist, but it leaves itself open to questions like, did no family members ever make a surprise visit and realize who she was? Her location being known to both her good and bad relatives is such an insane risk, and the book took that into account. Still not doing too badly, I guess. Let's see if they finally drop the ball in... Now usually with a good sized book and a regular length movie you'd have to assume there's a good deal cut out of the final script, but in this case that's not true. There's very little of the main plot not covered aside from the ending, which I'll go into in a second. The reason they could get away with this disparity in length is a large percentage of the book is given over to incredibly in-depth descriptions that, if you're patient enough to get through them, help build a good picture of the world around the characters but do nothing to further the plot. For example, there's a good few paragraphs of the book given over to describing literally every piece of furniture in a room, every book on the shelf, the angle the lamp is sitting on the desk, the smell of the sheets on the bed, and the way the light's falling on everything. If you condensed it down to just the stuff that advanced the story, it would have read, Blomkvist went into the cabin and found Harriet's Bible. That said, there were a few things here and there story-wise that didn't make it into the film either. They left out Blomkvist's past connection to the Wenger family. Apparently his father worked for them when Mikael was but a toddler and too young to remember them. The Swedish film went in the exact opposite direction with this by having Mikael have lots of flashbacks to Harriet looking after him. Both versions of the film skipped over Blomkvist starting a casual sexual relationship with one of Wenger's other nieces, Cecilia, while he was on the island. As is so often the case of such dalliances, someone ended up getting their feelings hurt. The film also left out Salander's mother, a woman in permanent care after her husband damaged her brain in an assault. Although her backstory isn't revealed in the first book, she's still fairly important as she unexpectedly passes away at the end, forcing Lisbeth to return to Stockholm instead of seeing the investigation through to the end. In the movie, she's replaced by Lisbeth's former legal guardian who suffered a stroke at the start of the film. In the book, this character wasn't expected to survive, and Lisbeth immediately cuts herself off from him to avoid emotional pain. The film's change involving Anita resulted in the omission of Blomkvist's trip to Australia to track Harriet down, as that was her original hiding place. I like this logic a lot more. If I wanted to completely disappear, the Australian outback would definitely be the ideal place to do it. This is a clear point in the Swedish film's favour. And lastly, they skipped over the cover-up that the Wenger family employed to keep Martin's crimes from the world. Lisbeth helped in exchange for the wealthy family agreeing to try to identify the victims and find a way to give their families closure, and also give a colossal amount of money per year to a charity for women in danger. Blomkvist is unhappily guilt-tripped into going along with it, despite it offending all of his morals and his journalistic integrity because he just couldn't bring himself to drag Harriet into the limelight. The Dom's final thoughts. So the obvious big question first, is the film accurate to the book? Yes, very. It's not 100% as there's still some of what I consider to be unnecessary changes, but they clearly went in with a lot of respect for the author, and they learnt a lot from the original Swedish film. I'd even go as far as to say it's actually good enough to justify its existence despite how unnecessary it appeared at first, so I'm now retroactively a little disappointed that the second and third books didn't get turned into films like they did in Sweden, especially considering the downer ending it had for Lisbeth. I'm afraid I can't offer you any sort of final judgment on which film was the better adaptation, it's just too close to call. And considering the vast differences in budget and the huge advantage the Americans had in that they could learn from the first film's mistakes, that's really saying something for Swedish filmmaking. If you're into dark murder mysteries, I recommend the book, and I do recommend both films, but if you've watched and enjoyed one recently, you might want to give it a while before you watch the other due to their similarity. Fare thee well, beautiful watchers, here's hoping for a slightly more light-hearted subject in the next episode.